today we will be talking with three very important people at the center who've been with it for years. Barbara Anderson, professor of sociology. She came to the University of Michigan in 1984. Zvi Gitelman, he is professor of political science and came to the University of Michigan in 1968. And John Fine, professor of history, he came to the University of Michigan in 1969. Welcome. And we'll just say that I'm Olga Virakhovskaya, and I'm a proud graduate of the center, 1996. So we will start from the beginning, from the early years. Zvi, John, you came to the center when just a few years, or even the next year, after the center became the Center for Russian and East European Studies, to recognize the university's commitment to the region. What do you remember about those years?
All right. well, see, Bornstein was the director at the time, and he was a very, very active figure, and all kinds of projects going on, and it was very, we had lots of activities. We had the same brown bags we have now, lots of lecture series, and possibilities of going abroad, and lots of grant money for the students, graduate students, and as well as for us for research in the summers. It was a very lively place.
I agree. When I came for my interview at the political science department, I spent some time with Morris, who was then the very efficient, that goes without saying, director of the center. Darlene Breitner was pegging away at a manual typewriter. It was in Lane Hall, which was a decrepit, but much more charming building than this, I must say. We had brown bags, as John mentioned, every Wednesday, and there was a rather predictable crowd, half of which didn't seem to be affiliated with the university, but was interested in the region. I particularly remember two categories of people. One were the celery chompers, and the other were the carrot crunchers. And they would predictably provide background noise for whoever the speaker was. But it was a rather engaged group. I had the luck, maybe, of arriving in September of '68, approximately 3 weeks after the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet Union and 5 of its allies. And East European studies, or at least East European politics, had not been taught yet at the university. I didn't know what to expect. Probably they didn't know what to expect. And conveniently enough, this invasion took place. Not convenient for the Czechs, but enrollment was very large. And I learned that academia follows the flag, which explains many of the trends, let's say, since 1991. And that was a very exciting time. In the first years that we were here, the survey courses were introduced, and I thought that was a major step in exposing students who would not specialize in the region to many aspects of the region. So first it was what was called 395, later became 595, God knows what it is today. The survey of the Soviet Union, and then
I think it's back to 395.
Oh, good. Well, that's where it should be. And then we had 396, which was the survey of Eastern Europe. So these were exciting times, and we were one of several burgeoning centers around the country. The Russian Institute at Columbia and the Harvard Russian Research Center were the first two, and then Berkeley and Ohio State and Michigan and several others were in the game, and there we were.
Interesting. Going almost 15 years forward, Barbara, you came in 1984. What was the center like at the time?
I wanted to say something about that. I came to Michigan from a tenured position at Brown, and CREES was one of the main reasons I came here. I've never regretted that. And at that time, it was in the middle of the Cold War, and I'd done work on the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and I'm a sociologist demographer, and I saw the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union as arenas to test mainline social scientific hypotheses and not to treat them like the moon. Now, at that time, that was a pretty radical point of view in the study of this region. And a couple of things attracted me about Michigan and CREES. One was, at that time, most Russian East European Studies centers were quite ideological, and were quite ideologically right-wing. And CREES wasn't left-wing, it wasn't right-wing, it was just scholarly, which I thought was incredibly unusual and admirable. Another thing was, when I was teaching at Brown, students would come to public talks I gave, and they'd come to ask me about what they could read, and I give them some stuff in English. And they'd say, well, how do we work on the kinds of things you work on? And I'd say, do you read Russian? And they'd say, no. And I said, well, I'm sorry, it's really not possible. And I thought that I'd be able to find here students with language and area knowledge, social science-oriented students with quantitative aptitude. Graduate students would be good, and this was phenomenally successful. And so I did not regret this at all. I also wanted to say something about the survey courses, which I also think are wonderful. From the time I came here, almost every year I've given a guest, well, at least one guest lecture in it. And when I was CREES director, I was at a Department of Education meeting, and I was talking to a director from another major center, from a renowned but unnamed university, and told him about this. And he thought, I was talking about 395, but one could have said about 396. He says, that sounds just great, because you know, the people show up and they give talks. But it's not like whatever they feel like that day. People get sort of told what to talk about. So it's a coherent course and not just a lecture series. And I've had students who've taken it saying it was the most integrated course with multiple speakers they'd ever taken, because it did actually make sense. And this director of this other esteemed center said, that sounds great. How do you get people to do this? And I said, well, we're a community. People do this as a matter of service and exposure to students and wanting to convey their knowledge, and they don't, for coming and giving one or two talks, they don't expect anything. And he said to me, he was being very nice, he said, well, that sounds really great, but we could never get faculty at our university to do this, because there was an insufficiently collective spirit at his university. And I think this has been one thing that has distinguished CREES and continues to be true, that it's a cross-disciplinary, cross-region, cross-humanities, social sciences, whatever kind of place. But there is some common identity which ties people together across faculty and students, and I think that this is a value-added kind of situation, which is extremely valuable. I said, this is one thing that brought me here, and it's part of the reason I've never regretted having come here.
One of the things that I found nice coming from Harvard, which of course is a rather Cold War place, but also the fact that humanities and the Slavic department is much more part of our center here than what say what was at Harvard.
This isn't all intellectual history and high politics. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would second that. I remember a person like Deming Brown, who taught Soviet literature, was someone I could talk to, and I didn't need the vocabulary of transgressing the canon and subverting the liminal space, or whatever the people in crit do these days. These were perfectly normal human beings who were speaking a language I could understand, and that was a big plus. And we had a very distinguished Slavic department. John Rinzero and Ladislav Matek. David Welsh was teaching Polish literature. Bill Dewey, who, as an example, was both in the history and in the Slavic department. So it was really community. One example that comes to mind of cooperation was Mars Bornstein, Bill Zimmerman, and I got a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, I think in the late 70s, and we managed to call a conference in Bellagio where we had people from Eastern Europe, mainly economists and political scientists, come together. And that was not a routine matter at that time, to get people from one side of the divide to convene with people from the other side. And it resulted in a book and long-term personal contacts. And that was cross-disciplinary.
Well, the three of you have held different administrative positions as well as academic, and you were in a position of leadership. Barbara, we'll start with you this time. You were CREES director twice. Right, you were.
See, it was not a bad experience the first time.
Second time?
It wasn't a bad experience the second time either.
Well, if I may, just to say, for the record, to state that you were director between 1999 and 2001, and then again 2003 to 2005. What were the challenges during those periods as a director?
Well, it was at a time period where I think we were successful in continuing something that started before, to expand the departmental and school associations of our faculty associates and our students. And this is a tricky business because the field and Nixir and all this had started sometime earlier to encourage area centers, including Russian East European area centers, to be a little more expansive in terms of who would be included. Some people in the area wanted to put extremely high language barriers to sort of keep out the riffraff in a sense. And the field was moving, and we were moving to people who had strong and sincere area interest in research, and essentially picked up what IRITS's criterion had become for funding of research proposals was not some cut and dried language knowledge requirement, but essentially to a requirement that people have the language and the area knowledge necessary for whatever their project was, which differs on what kind of project this is. And we went essentially the same way. The vast majority of our faculty associates continue to be people with field experience and language knowledge, which I think is quite appropriate, but people who had sincere interest in the area, and which wasn't just fleeting, who did not have that, were also qualified. We also did a couple of degree-related initiatives that I think were important. We developed new minors in a number of areas. We developed and got approved the graduate certificate program, which I think has been a good thing. We expanded connections, I think, with graduate students. This had always been true, but we did more to expand connections with graduate students in various departments with area interest and knowledge who did not otherwise have any formal association with CREES. I remember there was a visiting scholar from, I believe, Turkmenistan, who was a historian but was located in the engineering school. And I met her at some event, and she was very nice and knowledgeable. And I was CREES director, and I invited her to have an association with CREES. She couldn't imagine that she could get this because we weren't part of her funding source or anything. I said, no, we're interested in intellectual commonality, and you have these intellectual interests. And I had to kind of convince her I wasn't making a joke. And so she became associated with CREES, and the time of her visit, she had a lot to do with us. And we had a lot of experiences like that, which I think really further enriched CREES. We also had increasing connections which I think have only further gotten intertwined since then, which with what was the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies. And this has developed, I think, apace in a good way. Also, that was at the time when there came the development of the Center for European Studies. And it was an iterative project to figure out what the relationship was going to be between CREES and the Center for European Studies. It wasn't always obvious how this ought to develop, but I think that also has come along with its hills and valleys reasonably well over time.
Zvi, how does it compare with your experience? You were a director between 1980 and 83.
Yes, I even remember that. Although I probably have blotted out most of my administrative encounters with various officials of the university, because that has not been the most attractive part of my stay in Michigan for 43 years. Nevertheless, it was, in retrospect, a very lucky time. In my own department, political science, we had at least 3 people, sometimes 4, dealing with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Today we have no specialists in Russia, and some of my colleagues seem to be unaware of real countries and the need to know something about them, particularly on the part of our students, but I would say on the part of our faculty as well. And that's a shame. But Bill Ballas, Al Meyer, Bill Zimmerman, Matt Evangelista, and I were all around at the same time. We had 1.5 or 2 sociologists at any one time. We had anthropologists. We had an economist or 2 at one point. And not to speak of, I think, 4 historians. John did the Balkans. Roman Sporluk was doing the northern tier, as we called it. And wait, we had probably 5, right? Because Bill Rosenberg and Ron Suney and Bill Dewey and his successor Val Kivelson were all doing Russia. So in retrospect, these were the halcyon days, and maybe we have some Cold War nostalgia here, but so be it. And I couldn't agree more with Barbara that somehow, spontaneously, without anybody undertaking any artificial measures, we all clicked. And we found meeting at CREES, for whatever reason, to be very congenial. It was a real second home. We discovered, as administrators, that we didn't have the power that departments had. I think that would be true. But it was much more fun to be here.
Well, we were congenial. I think Zvi's dead right. That what we have, CREES has not a lot to sort of materially offer faculty in a certain sense, but really it's an issue of community and caring about promoting study and understanding of the region. So people do stuff out of a sense of community and service, which is what I was saying about the survey courses, which we can do here and we continue to do here. And I've run that course, I don't know, 3 or 4 times, and never really had any trouble getting faculty to agree and be extremely cooperative. And I think it's indicative of exactly all this, that we are a community.
John, you were associate director and student advisor between 1989 and into the mid-90s.
Yes, I was, I guess, well, Roman Sporluk, of course, was the director then, and certainly he made me, appointed me. And I think was I the first associate director? It hadn't been going on in that position very long. I wasn't the first, and so I had a chance to basically shape the office the way I wanted. So basically, I got rid of any kind of administrative work, and basically decided to turn it all into students. And I love working with students, and I've been an advisor of students for a long while, both in LS&A and also in my own department, history. So basically, I was the undergraduate advisor for the master's students, for the undergraduates, the CREES majors, and then also I supervised the senior theses of all the people here, and so I had a very, very good time. We had classes, courses. I think, again, it was fairly new, but I'm not sure. It started then with a senior seminar was created for the majors, as well as we had, of course, various other sort of courses for students who were majoring in this, as well as, of course, our 2 surveys. And so it was basically just a lot of fun. And this is I got to know all the graduate students and the seniors and so forth, and juniors in the program, and it was very nice to just interacting with them. But one of the things I think that should be mentioned is the center got grants, and the directors worked awfully hard to get these large grants and justify. And as far as I can remember, we never failed to get a major grant, which then enabled us. Because when I was being hired, I was paid for by the history department. But I have a feeling that some of the other people who were hired were actually financed by the center, which enabled us to have this many people in the area. I mean, we're one of the very few schools, and certainly I think one of the very, very few who still in the 21st century, who still have 2 Eastern Europeanists, in the sense, one for both the northern and the southern tier, and somebody one school out for another, so falling back to have somebody who's specialized in one area, then tries to cover both of them, and well, probably does the best that they possibly could, and certainly as well as, or better than I could do the northern tier, but it's so that was added a great deal for our possibilities, and of course it then made our Eastern, what do you call 396, our Eastern European course that much richer, and that course started, as I remember, rather uncoordinatedly. But over time, it became much more. By the time Barbara was here, I think it was actually coordinated. Because when we first started, everybody talked about what they wanted. So somebody, I don't know, would be talking about political party, how party organization or something, in the northern tier and the southern tier, that I'd be talking about something totally different, ethnicity or something of the sort. And then the coordination came over time.
I thought the Bogomil heresy fit perfectly well into 20th century politics.
Well, I thought so. I thought so too.
That's why we got along so well.
That's right, very definitely. And that's why probably the Michigan undergraduates, so many of them know what the Bogomil heresy was.
Don't push that too far.
In 395, by the time I came, you were sort of given your marching orders of what to talk about. And I talked about a variety of things over the years. But one year, I somehow ended up talking some about language policy in the Caucasus in the 1920s and 30s as part of this. So the next year, when my assignment came, I said, and we want you to talk about language policy in the Caucasus in the 1920s and 30s. I knew enough about this, so I said, okay. And I did it, and it was a variety of different topics, different times, but I think for quite a long time, the person organizing it has tried to put together a truly coherent course. And I think it's worked very well. We've been aided by usually excellent TAs or graduate student research assistants. But I think also what you said is dead right about the issue of grant writing and the success of this. But we're faculty who've done administrative work, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the excellent work of the staff. And over the years, especially, I think we need to single out Marisha and Donna. Like, without them, the place would have fallen apart. And it makes it possible for harried faculty that are undercompensated for the time that they spend here by any normal standards to not run out screaming bonzo mad, usually at least, is what the staff have done. And I think that has been incredibly key to all this.
All the way through, because that's given the continuity to the center.
Continuity is incredible.
We mentioned, I think I should mention her again. Basically, what held the center together in the beginning when I first arrived was Darlene.
Yes, Darlene.
Absolutely.
Yes. But for a long, long time, it's been Marisha and Donna.
Marisha stepped in and Donna formally, I have to say for the record.
Yeah, and it's been great.
Yeah.
And the people like Rachel and the people like Roberta came through, and Sylvia, such who have been very, very important in the time they've been here.
Well, I think
But not like the extent or the length of service that Marisha and Donna have and continue to provide.
But what else is add one more thing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, Darlene joined the center at the age of 16 or 17, right out of 17 or 18, right out of high school. So she, and that was one of the remarkable things with basically her, I mean, not having any more background than that. And she thought we were all crazy with what we were working on and so on, but she coordinated us very well.
Absolutely right.
One thing that's helped us be a community and has helped us in terms of these long-term dedicated staff people, which I think needs to be noted, we all know it, but this is time for noting stuff we all know, is that Donna and Marisha have extensive area knowledge. They're not just good administrators who happen to get plopped here. You know, Donna has a doctorate in sociology and did field work in Yugoslavia and knows a ton about this, has taught in the area. Marisha's worked in the area for a long time, has good Russian and Polish in contacts throughout the area. And so it's not just like a staff person who knows how to do staff things, but the combination with true deep area knowledge has made for much more effective working relations, cooperation, and for the faculty administrators and the staff to be a more effective team than I think would have been possible otherwise.
In fact, Marisha is one of our own master students. And I should say also that Donna has participated actively in some of the center activities, because when we put together our working group to go to Bosnia during the 1990s and so on.
Well, sure, because they know a lot about stuff.
Well, of course they know as much about it as we do. I mean, we academics, or not, she's an academic too, but as much as the people who actually, you know, in teaching departments. But I mean, Donna was tremendous. Contributed to our group in Bosnia, and she went on various trips. Bob and I Bob Donia and I made to Bosnia during the war and so forth. And
I think it's also worth noting, which was happening somewhat before I became director, but continued, the increasing strength and centrality of CREES in Polish studies. Marisha's played a major role in this. Michael Kennedy was clearly important. I think we did great to recruit in sociology Genevieve Zabriskie, and she's fantastic. People like Brian Porter, I always get his current last name wrong. Such, okay. And I think it's that we are now, at Michigan now, is the strongest center of Polish studies in the country. And I think that this has been a major achievement, which has and continues to strengthen the whole center.
One thing is worth mentioning, that pretty early on, we were able to invite people from communist countries to do a variety of things. Some of them that made their mark. I don't think there's any causal relationship. But Václav Klaus of Czechoslovakia lectured here. Jerzy Wiatr was a frequent visitor from Poland. Renata Siemienska as well. I had the privilege once of teaching a course jointly, this was unheard of, with a man named Krzysztof Ostrowski from Poland. And that was a really interesting experience, teaching with a Polish political scientist, and that was a rare breed, American students. And we also had our fun moments. Al Meyer once told me a story about, in the 70s probably, there was a phenomenon known as the New Left. And I think some students took our courses because they thought it had something to do with their presumed ideology. And they could get, for example, marks on the cheap. So a kid comes in to Al and he tells him, Professor Meyer, I'm determined to study Russian. He said, why do you want to study Russian? It's a difficult language. And the kid says, because I want to read Marx in the original.
Oh, golly.
I had a student once who was a self-proclaimed radical and had the whole get up, Red Star cap. And he was supposed to write a paper on some aspect of Lenin. So he said, could I write on Lenin's theory of imperialism? Great. First sentence read, Lenin had a theory of imperialism. Imperialism was what characterizes the American treatment of blacks. The rest of the paper was a screed about the terrible American treatment of blacks, which had been submitted for some other course. Well, I won't tell you what happened when I called this kid into the office, but there have been a lot of interesting experiences with students.
After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and when there became an increasing number of students who came, who had grown up in the former Soviet Union.
Oh, yeah.
And that has been quite interesting. And it has ups and downs, but there's had some very good parts. In the survey of the former Soviet Union course, there were often lots of students all over the place. And these students generally had a very good attitude. And they would often come up and say after some lecture, someone would say, now I understand what my parents and grandparents were talking about. Or I talked to my parents after every class about what we talked about that day. And they tended not to be know-it-alls with chips on their shoulder, but people who were pretty open to the idea that what they heard at home and at the dining table, that although they weren't rejecting it, that they wanted a broader, more scholarly perspective on this. And I think that's exactly what we ought to be doing as a center and university. One time I remember giving a lecture in 395 about language groups and the overlap or lack of overlap between language groupings and religion and such. And I was talking about the CREES language, which is a Turkic language spoken mainly by people in Lithuania who are Jews. So I was saying this as an example that these things don't always go together nicely. And I said how I'd been in a Korean restaurant in Lithuania, and they had all this stew in little pots, and it was really good. And I was telling these stories. So after class, this student comes up to me and said, I was so glad to hear you say it. I have an uncle who's Korean. He's so glad to hear it about this in school. It's good to know what you're talking about when you say these obscure things. But I thought that was just super, and he could not have been more thrilled.
Well, let's talk about the courses a little more. We already covered a lot of ground, but I would like to tie it to the political changes in the region. How did that affect the curriculum?
What changes?
Well,
in the region or the courses?
Well, we talked about the Prague Spring a little bit. The Cold War is the obvious, but maybe we can talk about the solidarity or restoring glasnost in the clubs of the Soviet Union.
Well, as I said, the student interest and general public interest obviously follows the news. And you can see that also in language enrollments. Arabic language enrollment has shot up, displacing the popularity of Japanese, which was only about 10 years ago. Chinese language enrollment is probably high. And Slavic language enrollment is probably down from what it was, 20, 25 years ago. So that happens with our courses too. And it also means that some of our yellowing notes no longer can be used, which is all to the good. But I think a point that Barbara made earlier should be brought out, namely that is, I think it's true, you were way ahead of the rest of us in this, not only you personally, but your discipline. Our disciplines our courses and our own research have become more aware of our disciplines. In other words, Soviet East European studies used to be a separate kind of study. almost isolated. And for a variety of reasons, we've moved, for better or for worse, toward greater integration with our respective disciplines. So that's maybe one way in which our courses have changed, our research has perhaps changed as well.
Sociology didn't have to recover from the Soviet era and the Cold War as much because it didn't make such a big deal of it. I mean, we have great political scientists here, like Zvi, who's always been very centrally involved in issues in political science, but in some political science departments during the Soviet period, people could get jobs just for being Soviet-watching specialists without necessarily having contemporary theory and methodological tools. And I remember in 1986, I was asked to come and talk to the Joint Committee on Soviet Studies of Social Science Research Council about what needs to be done to increase the supply of sociologists who studied the Soviet Union. And before that, I did a little inventory of all the tenured and tenure-track sociologists in sociology departments of universities. At that time, I think there were 13 such people at 12 universities, and included some people way back from the Harvard Project who were still around. And what I told them, and I still believe is true, is that in sociology, having an area of specialization is not a handicap. It's actually an advantage. But it doesn't excuse you from anything. It doesn't excuse you from being current in theory and methods and all that. But if you have an area of specialization, in addition, this is all to your benefit. And someone on the committee said, yeah, but that's hard. I said, well, I never said it was easy. We're getting now, and I think sociology still feels this way. And if I may brag a little bit about our sociology department, we are the most internationally oriented of any top sociology department, with probably between a quarter and a third of faculty in sociology being true area specialists with field experience and language. And it's not like then there's the sociologists and then there's the area specialists. It's all integrated. And we've also gotten, over the years, people, a steady flow of graduate students who got their area knowledge through paths such as being in the Peace Corps in Russia or Ukraine. And then end up, and they've been CREES, student associates, and often with dissertations about the area and gone on. And so this is another strain of people who are coming.
But this is all connected to centers, I mean, not just limited to us, but in Near East, China Center, Japan Center, all of these. So then we have all these different area interests. And so that's where we'll have sociologists in all these different areas, or historians and so forth.
And that, we can infer this from what you said, but I think it should be made explicit. One of the big changes that occurred beginning in the late 80s was access. The ability to do field work and the ability of historians to go into archives. It's not been linear, and it's not the same in all places and at all times, but that's made an enormous difference. And we used to lament the fact that we didn't have enough information. We didn't really know what was going on. We couldn't really do field work. And then came a period of time when we felt, I think, we had too much information. We couldn't absorb it all, couldn't manage it all. And there are relatively few constraints on doing field work. So in that sense, we're more similar to colleagues who are in different areas of the discipline. We can do as much field work as anybody who's working in Africa or Latin America.
I think something John said earlier was quite important. Several things you said earlier were important.
Oh, thank you.
But one was this issue of the open-mindedness of departments. I remember when we were searching in sociology for someone who did macro sociology. And Michael Kennedy, who at the time was an assistant professor at University of South Carolina, came to the top of the list. And he was our top candidate. And I heard not a single person in my department say, well, maybe we shouldn't interview him because he studies Poland and Barbara studies the Soviet Union, and isn't this by some weird way overlap? No one argued that at all. And then after Michael was here, when we were searching in Genevieve, Zabriskie became our top candidate in a general open search. She did very different work than Michael. I also don't remember anyone in my department saying, do we really need another person who studies Poland? Because the department was just thinking, who does good work? And if it was on different kinds of topics, they didn't care if it was the same region of the world. And I think that is quite admirable, and I'm not sure at all universities that would have been the response.
One of the things also was interesting when I was tying up with, say, the center directors. We had a lot of political science center directors who were obviously current oriented, and the support that they always were giving to me, because most of my early research was in the Middle Ages, and obscure places like medieval Bosnia and so forth, and whatever I seemed to want funds for, and so on, I mean, the center director would support me right down the line. And some, once again, I'm not necessarily sure that would have been true in some of the Ivy League centers I can imagine or have been at. So that, which is one of the interesting things. The one I can come in with one criticism, which of course is all because of government funding, because there's one part of the Balkans that has always been left out, namely Greece. Of course, the problem was Greece didn't go communist, and if Greece had gone communist, then it would have. And somehow, in a sense, there was this great gap in the area, which I've always regretted. And of course, then Greece is not it used to be an NDFL language and so forth, and so on. And so it would be nice if we also had to see modern Greece included in all of this, because it's a beautiful thing for comparative purposes as to the different paths that Greece and, say, in Yugoslavia, Greece and Bulgaria took.
Another occurrence which is worth noting, which also happened while I was center director, was the celebration of the 300th anniversary of the founding of St. Petersburg. And Mauritia played a key role in all of that. This was in association with the University of Michigan Museum of Art. That was a huge success. There was a wide variety of events which were stunningly successful. And the Russian embassy in Washington said that they thought that what the University of Michigan did between CREES and the Museum of Art and the University Musical Society was the best celebration of this event that happened anywhere outside of Russia, which is pretty darn good.
They tell that to all the girls. And speaking of which, the terrific events that surrounded the Solidarity movement and the round table, and having a very bright and interesting former president of Poland, Kwasniewski, come several times, Havel, president of Czechoslovakia, come, for a place that's not on the East Coast, that's not politically terribly relevant. I think that's, again, a tribute to the staff and the initiative of various people around the center.
Then you take it opposite direction, how these center as a whole would support the odd whims of faculty interest and so on. Because back in I think it was either 1993 or 1990. No, it would have been 1993. There were a bunch of us, around the country, a handful of people who wanted to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Russian Orthodox theologian named George Florovsky. And lo and behold, the center was with great enthusiasm. He supported me, got the money to put on these, and so I could then bring a whole bunch of a small little circle of Russian Orthodox theologians and so forth in, made a lovely conference.
It was known as the Florovsky Festival.
I think that basically the deep scholarly and non-ideological orientation of the center has continued. I remember at the 10th anniversary of the Polish Roundtable, there were letters from the Pope and other such dramatic and great things. But it was not just a rah-rah Poland event. It was intellectually critical. And there were people like the Polish priest who was liaison to the Jews, who was a great guy and had a lot of pretty critical things to say. And this was a scholarly, non-ideological approach throughout. I think also in this vein, in recent events of the work that Ron Suni and Gerard Liberidian and Muge Gocek have been doing about Turkey and Armenia, which among other things has led to death threats on them. But it has gotten Muge a lot of criticism from the Turks and Gerard a lot of criticism from the Armenians. So they must be doing something right. And their edited book with Norman Naimark just came out. Muge showed it to me today. It's nice. So their biggest argument was the color of the cover. Whether they have a bright color or a subdued color. But this is intellectually a safe space where people from these diverse intellectual interests, backgrounds, national origins, you might say, could get together and talk reasonably and be safe and not have people vehemently attacking them.
And also with the cooperation, once again, of two centers.
Yes.
Not only our center, but also the Near East Center.
Yes.
What conversations about the future of the center do you have with colleagues and others?
They're privileged.
All right, we can skip this one.
I'll just give another example of what the center did when I was had just arrived here. And I'd been over in graduate when I was doing my PhD work over in Sarajevo. That I just found there one of the modern historians named Milorad Kmečić had beautiful English, and so we thought it'd be sort of fun to basically have an exchange ourselves. And so we agreed that I was going to my wife and I were going to move into his apartment and take his salary, and then he could come over and do the same thing with our house. And so basically we had everything and all set up, and both universities, well, the two departments agreed to it. And basically that was all I guess one needed. But there's of course no money to bring any of these families. So we each had at that point a young 2 or 3 year old plus a couple on each side, and so the center thought it was a great idea. I think it was Al Meyer, I believe, was the director at the time. Thought it was a fabulous idea, and came basically my return mail or notice that we had my money for our travel, both couples travel. It was a very successful exchange.
Well, about the future, given the experience in the past, I think, and I'm an optimistic person, I think it will all go well in the future. But I think some things that some of us are concerned in a good way to maintain is the scholarly, intellectual, non-ideological, non-politicized kind of and safe space kind of nature of the place to negotiate the dynamic tension between broadening spread before you dilute to being 1/4 inch thick, and how you keep the concentration of sufficient mass of expertise across various areas while there's interchange. That how do you maintain autonomy and community at the same time, which is, I think, an ongoing project in any kind of organization like this. But I also think these are things that if people don't keep on thinking and paying attention to them, then you have problems. So,
But we just mentioned it, community and autonomy.
Yes.
Individual autonomy is something the center, the whole time I've been here since 1969, has basically been a model of that.
yeah, but we want to keep it going.
Oh yes, the point is, having kept it going for so long is quite remarkable.
as I said, the experience in the past makes me hopeful about the future, and like we can all come back in 50 years, right, and say how we thought it's gone.
I'm a little less sanguine because I see a Slavic department which is down to 8 people, a history department which may or may not replace a very distinguished Russian historian, as far as I know.
I'm very much afraid that if I were to retire, I'm not sure they're going to replace. I'm not sure they're going to replace that, which is why I'm not going to retire. But
right, we do not have a full-time Russianist in the political science department, and I think sociology is an anomaly. But it's because they weren't looking for an area person and just happened to get one. But I don't think we can count on these happy accidents in the future. And if we believe, as I do, and I suspect all of us do, that a deep, intensive knowledge of the area is required not only for scholarly, but I would say for civic purposes. That is, individual Americans should know about these places, these people, their histories, their culture, their politics. Then we have to be, to borrow a Soviet term, constantly on guard and active in maintaining, at the very least, if not expanding, our present assets, which are considerable, but which could easily be eroded in the short term.
Certainly, I would say there are a lot of publications, because we had, once again, as a result of the Cold War, was a PL 480, and the library collection, we were one of the deposit libraries, getting all these newspapers and journals and everything in the Sun, and I suspect that we do not have any longer, and the already subscriptions to journals and newspapers and so on are way down, because obviously in our budget, that's not going to be a top priority as it has been in the past. And I assume, once again, that all this PL 480 money in connection with the library, I'm sure, went through the center, right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't just directed to the library.
And the center had its own library.
Oh, yes.
And the center used to publish those nice red-covered off-prints.
Oh, yes.
We're told by the head of the library that it doesn't matter because it'll all be out there in the ether. Maybe.
We do need an optimistic meeting.
Don't count on me.
Well, it's been a great pleasure talking with you, asking you these questions, and thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much.
It's been a lot of fun, as it always is around CREES, isn't it?
Right. Thank you.
Thanks.